Hey, it's Justin Harvey. Thanks for tuning in to the Anesthesia and Pain Management Success podcast. With APM Success, we take a close look at important topics pertaining to business, practice management, personal finance, and careers for anesthesiologists and pain management physicians. We work hard to take your critical questions straight to the experts. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to another episode of APM Success. Happy 2024. I have a special guest today, Dr. Josh Lumbley. Dr. Lumbley is somebody who comes with a wealth of experience in a number of different practice settings and even different industries. And I'm excited to talk with him today about his career journey, about where he sees the future of anesthesia going, and to be able to learn from him. Welcome, Dr. Lumbley.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I appreciate it. It's nice to be here.
Before we hit record, we were reflecting on our mutual experience in the Eastern Ohio, Western Pennsylvania area. Actually, a big game this past week with the Steelers and Bengals.
I know. Well, it's, you know what, you're kicking me while I'm down. But having said that, so yes, I was disappointed. I was disappointed that Ohio State lost to Michigan. Michigan played a flawless game.
That too.
So for the Michigan fans that are on the podcast, you deserve to win. You played really, really good ball. Having said that, I grew up in Austin, and so I'm cheering for the Longhorns this weekend. This is going to be broadcast in January, so we'll all know what's going to happen. But go Longhorns! Hopefully, you win the Big 12 title this weekend, and you can sneak your way into the college football playoff.
Maybe for starters, Dr. Lumbley, give us a little context on your current career sort of track and your scope of responsibilities.
Yeah. So my elevator pitch for my role right now is I'm a practicing clinical anesthesiologist. I would define myself as mid-career. I graduated residency in 2009. So crazy to think that I've been practicing anesthesia for almost 15 years now. Board certified anesthesiologist that practices clinically, but I'm also chief quality officer of a large anesthesia management company. I oversee the clinical practice of about 3,000 anesthesiologists and nurse anesthetists across 27 states and over 250 practices. I really focus on three main areas. It is driving standardized clinical practice across the locations. So if you're getting your total knee done in Philadelphia, Detroit, Dallas, we know that the anesthetic experience and overall quality is pretty replicable across those various clinical environments. Secondarily, pushing to become a patient safety organization. And then number three is reporting quality metrics to CMS and third-party payers. So overall, a lot of difficult decisions, but enjoy doing it. And it's a nice balance to being in the ORs and taking care of patients.
I have a lot of questions, and part of me, obviously, I'm not a clinician and I'm not a consultant. Yeah. I sort of play a consultant on TV every now and then. But I'm always interested in understanding the business of anesthesia and of medicine and the economics of the healthcare system. And just operationally too. So I think this is a great opportunity for listeners to understand how someone sort of from your perspective is trying to roll out on a broad scale, quality and consistency, sort of checks and balances and policies and procedures and all that. I'm curious, what are, if you think about 3,000 clinicians and 27 states, what are the biggest challenges that you face in terms of creating a consistent anesthetic experience and outcome?
I mean, right now, both our practice and the practices of all the folks that are on this podcast that are listening, it is an exquisitely tight labor market. It is very difficult to have a fully staffed practice right now. There's it's kind of a really difficult environment between increasing labor costs. So compensation is increasing dramatically. Sometimes, I think the ASA reported that last year average salary increase was somewhere in the neighborhood of like 8 to 14% across the country. This is very similar with nurse anesthetists and AAs as well. And at the same time, a difficult reimbursement environment, where margins and reimbursements on a pay per unit basis for the types of procedures and the care that we provide is being like reduced and reduced and reduced. So when you think about like the basic economics of anesthesia, it is revenue from cases, and up against labor costs. And it used to be that revenue might exceed labor costs or might match labor costs. But what we're seeing now is that labor costs are dramatically increasing above those labor costs. And so you're having to go to hospital partners, ASC partners, and say, you got to make up the difference. And that is a really difficult conversation to have.
I have a hypothesis about this, and I don't usually get a chance to talk to somebody who's so smart in these areas to ask this question. Do you view what's happening as a natural correction as a result of the sort of shifting of the reimbursement over time and removing value from the physician labor component of the calculation and moving it to the facility side?
I mean, honestly, I think it is just an exquisitely, I'm a little bit more cynical, and I think it is an environment where it's just very, very difficult to negotiate with payers on the national basis, or at the on the commercial side of things. Increasingly, as there's kind of a level playing field that everybody is sort of essentially paid the same, with the elimination of, with the advent of the No Surprise Billing Act this past year. It's a level playing field for everyone. Everyone is, there's no secret sauce. They just sort of say everybody gets kind of paid the same. Increasingly, value, quality, the type of product that you deliver is on the tip of the tongues of both payers as well as hospital partners. Having said that, they still hold the keys to deciding, how much you're going to get reimbursed. It's a really, I would say, it sounds pessimistic. I am optimistic on the future of medicine. I'm optimistic on the future of anesthesia, very bullish on it. Having said that, it's a challenging market right now on the staffing side and on the reimbursement side.
I've observed all these same trends. Who is the loser in this dynamic? And I know with the No Surprises Act, it was always, depends on, like, I think there's not a lot of people that understand who the stakeholders are and and who the hostages are. And I know that doctors and hospitals are often lumped together in the press, like doctors and hospitals versus insurance companies. And I think that's a mistake. But as these pressures have been exerting themselves in your practice and the scope of sort of your perspective, I'm worried about some of the safety net hospitals or hospitals without the margin and without the ability to give you the extra $2 million stipend because you can't afford to recruit anesthesiologists because you can't get the reimbursement. It seems like access is going to be a big problem in 2024 and beyond. I'm curious how you, especially being in Ohio where you are, and you've got that sort of that area of the country where there's a lot of that.
Yeah. No, I mean, wow. Those are very astute observations. So in the thick of it, it feels like clinicians and their practices are the ones that are experiencing the difficult, that are kind of experiencing most of the friction right now with the current environment. Having said that, ORs have to run. For the most part, labor and delivery units have to be staffed. And so it is our hospital partners that are bearing a lot of those challenges right now. Now, their reimbursement on procedures and things like that has not been hit as hard as anesthesia. So fortunately, overall margins have improved post-pandemic there. And so there hopefully is some willingness to kind of say, this is what it's going to take to staff our operating rooms. That said, on the access side, with some rural hospitals across the country are closing labor and delivery units just because the economics don't go around the block there. So, you're starting to see, there was actually an article in New York Times this summer about, basically the West Texas all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley, a lot of hospitals that are shutting down labor and delivery services. And so some women are having to drive 150 miles to hospitals to, receive maternal care and obstetric care. So yes, at some of, both small and large hospitals are having to make these, very difficult decisions right now on what is, how do we continue to stay open, providing services to our patients in a market where the economics are pretty difficult.
In terms of the quality metrics that you are observing, implementing, trying to manage, what are the some of the key focuses of your work in terms of quality, and where do you exert your time and effort in that regard?
Yeah, there's we try to be as uniform in what we report out to CMS and third-party payers, and those tend to be MIPS measures, so merit-based incentive payment schedule measures that are ascertained and measured on every single case, whether it's an open heart cardiopulmonary bypass and your avoidance of cerebral hyperthermia or sterile line placement, all the way to an ambulatory procedure on an ASA 1 or 2. And you're assessing, giving that patient multimodal postoperative nausea and vomiting prophylaxis. But we report those out. In some of our larger facilities that have anesthesia information management systems, AIMS platforms, where the electronic anesthesia record, we're able to do deeper dive on metrics like length of stay in PACU, unexplained admission, prolonged or reintubation, anesthesia-specific complications. It's a little bit easier to do that with those sorts of platforms than it is with a paper chart. So a whole host of measures that we use to kind of drive continuous improvement.
Can you help me understand the difference between sort of a MIPS paradigm and a X number of units to start, X units per hour, X units for a procedure, and any other sort of complexity modifiers?
Yeah. So that latter part, X units to start, X units per unit time, that still persists. There is a very gradual shift away from away from maybe let's say procedure-based billing towards value-based reimbursement. It is going to take some time. We've been talking about this since the mid 2000s, and it still persists. I think there was a lot of momentum towards basically the way MIPS work is small percentage on the bottom that get penalized, a group in the middle based on performance that sort of are status quo. You need to get penalized, you don't get a bonus. And then there's a group at the top that are rated by exceptional, and they get a bump up to 9% on their CMS reimbursements. The dream scenario is that you can then use that performance to sort of leverage better payment with commercial payers. But even if that's not the case, if you've got 60% of your patients are Medicaid and Medicare, 40% of them are Medicare, that's a big bump if you can get that. They threw that out the window during COVID because didn't want anybody to get penalized. So 23 is the first year that the penalty is in place, and the first year that we are going to be allowed to actually get up to 9% of a bonus. And so it would be on top of the build blank for procedure, build blank for complexity, build blank per unit time, and then do you get the bonus on top of that based on your clinical performance. And the hope is that sort of opens the door to more of a value-based paradigm in the future where you have to report these metrics, you have to, or you're going to get penalized if you don't, and you got to do really well with them, based on a whole host of metrics, and whether or not how they impact the patient down their care continuum.
Has there been any observed connection between sort of the MIPS reporting with Medicare and commercial contracts and reimbursement?
At this point, no. And so there are some folks that are pretty skeptical about it. My perspective is it is the best way. It is a sort of imprecise measure, but it's the best way for your practice and your department to sort of compete across the country, and for you to have an idea of like, how good are we and how do we compete across the country with other practices of similar size and of similar case mix.
Yeah, thinking about reimbursement and looking at the fee schedule every year, it's like, oh, there's another 3%, there's another 3%, there's another 4%.
Yeah.
It's like, well, 9% is great if you nail it. But that's only on the percentage that you get Medicare. And honestly, like, if it's a really impactful, again, I try to not be too cynical, but if you have a huge chunk of Medicare and you're really trying to get this to work for your department because of all the Medicare people you have, you're probably having trouble paying your bills anyway because you don't have enough commercial contracts to keep things afloat.
Yeah, I think that the one point on that is Medicare reimbursement to the hospital, to the surgeon for the procedure itself is still quite good. Where the difficult part is taking it on the chin as a department of anesthesia. It is just unique to anesthesiology, those reimbursements. Again, the cost center for the hospital and for certainly an ambulatory surgery center, but for the hospital is the operating rooms. And so you've got to have the individuals to provide the anesthesia to ensure that surgeries happen, whether that's at a hospital, an inpatient facility, or an ambulatory surgery center. And so, it is unfortunate that it is pretty isolated to the Department of Anesthesia in terms of reimbursement. Having said that, our hospital partners are savvy enough to realize, like, kind of, it is what it is. This is what we've got to have. And so when the Department of Anesthesia comes and says, we got 60% CMS or 50% Medicare, Medicaid patients, and this is what it's going to take for us to be continually able to staff this place, this is what the stipend looks like. It's a difficult conversation, but it's kind of part and parcel with keeping the ORs open.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for our listeners who aren't familiar with anesthesia billing, it would be a common practice for the anesthesia department to bill based on their labor. They get reimbursed based on the revenue associated with providing the care to that patient based on whoever their insurer is. Often this creates a shortfall you can't pay an anesthesiologist enough based on just doing, it's like $30 a unit or something, which is $120 an hour at the revenue before you pay any expenses associated with anesthesiologist employment. And so it is then incumbent upon the hospital to make up that delta between what Medicare is going to pay and what it costs to have an anesthesia department. And that delta is known as the stipend, which is the money that the hospital throws on top of whatever the anesthesia provider can recoup from insurers in order to keep things running. And so
that's exactly right.
What we're describing here is the increasing stipend over time, and the hospital, I guess, like bearing more and more of that financial burden as the practice of anesthesia itself is reimbursed more and more poorly by CMS, which just makes it more expensive to run ORs, which is why it's going to become a luxury good here. I mean, it's already happening, I think.
Yep. Yeah. And then I would just say, to put some gasoline on that fire, then you also have labor costs that have gone up, that have increased. Salaries for anesthesiologists, salaries for nurse anesthetists that have increased. And so that labor cost, table, chunk of the pie has increased, while the reimbursement side of it has decreased.
So we discussed the idea of different practice models, and in the context of what's going on right now, with I think MIPS being more and more important, more and more boomers becoming Medicare eligible, being able to capture any bit of revenue is going to be important. I'm curious your reflection on sort of the baseline infrastructural requirement in terms of the practice of anesthesia. Obviously, NorthStar is a big organization, well resourced to be able to capture all of the capture, document, analyze, and improve all the quality metrics we're talking about. Um, I I am curious to just hear kind of how you process that and other clinical models and what the future looks like.
Yeah. Well, so during COVID, there was an acceleration. So hospitals shut down, hospital operating rooms shut down. That financial driver for hospitals was largely closed. Ambulatory surgery centers, there are surgeons that still wanted to operate. There are patients that still wanted to have their procedures done in a safe manner. One of the great things about all of us as anesthesiologists is that we continue to provide better care, better techniques to reduce length of stay, to reduce complications, to alleviate pain in an opiate-free sort of environment. And so a lot of previously inpatient procedures or procedures that were done in hospitals shifted over to ambulatory surgery centers. And a lot of our surgeon partners sort of said, you're able to do this in 2020 and early 2021, I'm never taking these cases back. I'm going to keep them right here at my ambulatory surgery center. And so that volume leaked out, and it's going to be tough to get that volume back. It may never come back. So what was left in hospitals was a little bit more challenging patient population, difficult, both from a payer mix standpoint, but also just, maybe multi-system organ dysfunction patients that aren't eligible for going to an ambulatory surgery center. And then frankly, just volume lower than what it was before. And so sort of what that gets us to is a roundabout way of me saying, like, that's okay. But the previous dynamic of where, maybe you had volume was here pre-pandemic and now it's here post-pandemic, but you still had operating rooms to staff here and now you got volume here. You've got to have a very difficult conversation with a hospital partner to say, you had volume here, volume is here now, it's lower, and you had number of operating rooms to match the original number, but now volume may be down, 10%, 12%, whatever it is. It might be beneficial for us to discuss actually closing operating rooms or reducing service in a couple of those operating rooms so that, we've got increased utilization in those operating rooms, knowing that staffing it is pretty high, is expensive. Keeping the lights on there are pretty expensive. Just OR costs in general are expensive. So maybe instead of 50%, 40% utilization, let's shrink the hours down to 4, or let's shrink the number of days down to 3, or whatever it is, trying to get that number jacked up to 80, 90%, while at the same time, balancing the ebbs and flow of the operating room and the needs of trauma, et cetera, that just sort of come, at random periods, but trying to staff the ORs more efficiently post COVID, post leakage of volume to an ASC.
And buy a couple ASCs in the meantime if you don't already have them as a hospital, since that is the way that the secular winds are blowing.
That's correct.
And insurers are incentivized in many cases to
that's exactly
push
right.
things that way because of cost.
That's correct. Yeah.
So how does that impact anesthesiologists?
I mean, so the good news is there's a insane amount of demand for our services. And I believe that there will continue to be a huge amount of demand for our services and the type of care that we provide, the fact that we continuously improve. And where I kind of do sort of see is opportunity for us is sort of roles like myself of being like a consultant to your hospital partners to say, like, let's go deep on the data here and look at OR operations and figure out a better way to staff it more efficiently. I've got a a tight labor market. You hospital CEO, you hospital COO have a tight labor market in terms of, OR nursing staffing and perioperative staffing. Like, let's align our resources to unfortunately make some difficult decisions, but on the back end, for more efficient, I think, rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of the ways that you most productively collaborate with hospital executives? Where you see the biggest, perhaps blind spots? It's easy to healthcare is very siloed, and I think that's kind of by design. I see one of the things of the people I follow on LinkedIn about, the healthcare analysts and things, they say, people say healthcare is broken. Healthcare is actually a system that is perfectly designed to achieve the outcome it's currently achieving. And that's a little bit of you could call it cynical, you could call it conspiratorial, but I'll just sort of set that here and we can leave that on the table as we're having this conversation. In terms of your interaction with hospital executives, where are you finding that you're bringing the most insight, or what are you hearing from them in terms of their pain points? And can you just help us understand that dialogue?
Yeah, I think the first is now is not speaking jargon to your hospital partner, and kind of getting to a point to understand that, like, not all volume is good volume. We have to take care of our patients, but we have to do it ideally in a manner that is as predictable as possible. And part of this is, again, presenting data, walking through, sort of by time of day, where are there opportunities? Dr. So-and-so likes his block to start at 10 in the morning and run until 6 p.m. Like, how can we incentivize this surgeon to maybe kick it up to 8 to 7 even, so that I can shrink in that after hours utilization, that witching hour of, all of your anesthesiologists that are on here are going to talk about, man, it's tough between 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. And if I could get that more predictable, if I could get, a lot more stuff shoved at the beginning of the day, boy, that would be helpful. And there's opportunity there for opening operating rooms, and it's, desirable for nurse anesthetists sometimes to staff in the morning as opposed to after hours cases. And I think it is just, like being a true consultant in anesthesiology, saying, I provide great clinical care, but really, I also know how to run the operating rooms. Like, the person they call is me. Surgeon X calls me to say, figure out how to make this happen. How can I get this gallbladder that's in the ED going? So maybe I don't have to start at 9 p.m., but, is there a way that we can work it in the schedule? And oftentimes, our departments of anesthesia are the ones that are most creative, are most knowledgeable in kind of running the board and taking ownership of that.
Can you zoom in on that a little bit and give us a couple anecdotes of conversations with hospital execs or with surgeons, sort of identifying problems, playing whack-a-mole with OR efficiency and trying to keep things running smoothly?
Yeah, I think, one of them is, a lot of your listeners, a lot of your anesthesiologists will talk about this concept of flip rooms, of, hey, we're going to let, say I'm a surgeon, I do my first case, it's 2 hours long, I start it in one room, and then they wheel the other patient back to the other room and get that started. Meanwhile, that room has been vacant now for 2 hours while I'm in the opposite room operating, and now that first room I'm in is vacant for 2 hours while I'm operating in the other room. And there probably are experts. I know that there's going to be a publication next year on the economics of flip rooming. I don't have, it's embargoed data. I haven't read it. I don't know what it says. I wouldn't be surprised if it says there's really not a benefit to flip rooming. But, part of it is just, that's an example of one to say, like, your staff is sitting idle 50% of the time. My staff is sitting idle 50% of the time. Is there a way for us to, like, work creatively? Like, I guarantee that I'm going to crush it from a room turnover time. and your team is going to crush it from a room turnover time. Is there a way that we can bring all those cases into one room so that we are not having 50% of our staff sitting idle, knowing that like we're both aligned, let's turn the room over as fast as possible, and we're collaboratively going to go to surgeon Y and say like, we're going to do a pilot project for just 2 months where we're going to try this. And at the end of this, it is, you say there's absolutely no way and it's not successful, then we'll talk about what are the other options of maybe going back. But let's try this because it really helps the hospital economics. It helps the Department of Anesthesia economics. And we don't necessarily think it is going to hurt you in terms of turnover time.
You also need to, I'm sure, manage, the surgeon personality and or preference for schedule and or compensation structure. If you've got a doctor who's on RVUs and they got to hit their X thousand, per quarter or per year, and you're going to mess with my throughput. Yes. There's a lot of stakeholders.
There are, and that's why so much of being a kind of a physician leader is persuasion and influence, and applying those soft skills in communicating to the stakeholders as you described.
Do you have any either resources or influences for yourself as you think about powers of persuasion that have been most impactful in helping you understand how to do that well?
I mean, I think, some of it sometimes is just is like working on emotional intelligence. There's a whole host of books on that, and I think some of it just comes from experience of saying, wow, when I messaged it this way, that just went over like a bunch of lead balloons, or when I messaged it this way, this was received. This was received well. I would say that, for the vast majority of the folks listening on this call, like you're in the ORs, you're working alongside these surgeons. They're requesting you to do their cases. They're putting a huge amount of trust in you. So you already have sort of the political capital to be able to have these sorts of conversations with them, with the perioperative staff and with hospital administration in a way that, like, while I'm clinical at certain locations, and Josh in a white coat and scrubs is received one way, Josh in a shirt and tie and a blue blazer is received a very different way by clinicians. And there is oftentimes a either distrust or just sort of like, you're a consultant. Well, I am, but I'm also, practicing anesthesiologist. So this is how I've seen it benchmarked in other locations. But, by being a person that's on the ground at that location, a leader at that location, you already have some, like I said, political capital, that folks will listen to you.
Makes sense. There's a lot. That's a very loaded and complex set of circumstances in which you're operating there, and I don't envy that, but have a lot of respect for it. I want to pivot. So you are a professional of interdisciplinary interest and expertise, and it's not just in medicine.
That's right.
Our mutual friend, Dr. Zwade Marshall, shout out to Dr. Marshall, is your partner in Doc to Doc. So tell us a little bit about how you and Dr. Marshall got connected with this, what started as a side project and is now a full-blown business with a bunch of staff and an awesome mission.
Yeah. So, on a personal note, I had always sort of been interested in personal finance, dating sort of all the way back to residency and the challenges of a certain salary in Boston, newlywed, with a mortgage, and trying to figure out how to have things go around the block financially. So that is a perspective that was a sort of like itch that always existed with me. Just enjoyed doing it. And, maybe it's the efficiency type A-ness of being an anesthesiologist, not sure, but it was a personal interest. So Zwade and I were fortunate enough to go to the same residency program. I went much earlier than he did, but we met very serendipitously at a ASA annual meeting, and he described, what he was working on with Doc to Doc, and I was like, oh my God, now in my current role, I see a lot of this, with some of the physicians that I work alongside, the teams that I manage, of physicians that I often am like, oh my gosh, like what everybody has a different life. Life happens to everybody, but wow, like you have no liquidity, or oh my gosh, like you're making a really good salary, and some of the financial decisions that you're making are very problematic. So that was, I was coming at it from a mid-career or an early career standpoint, but Zwada was describing it as like, this is a product, a personal loan product that is for physicians all the way along their journey. And, it resonated with me as a resident, thinking about like having to take not being able to afford to move from Boston to my first job because, my credit card would only go to $5,000. I didn't know where I was going to get the money to pay for that. To what I was, or my credit card was max, excuse me, but the max was $5,000. And then on the other hand, to what I was seeing kind of real time with my, with my teammates, the teams that I managed in mid-career. So yeah, and we just sort of like had a wonderful conversation, and I was like, I am all in on this. How can I help? And one thing led to another.
And so what was the, is the first, obviously I've had a lot of these conversations where, you're a couple friends drinking a beer together at a conference, back of a napkin. It's a long distance from that napkin to, where you are now. So what were some of the key components of like solidifying that journey and getting momentum with the business?
So the process, so I was not, Zwadi and his co-founder, Kenton, had done a lot of the work by the time I came on board in 2019 as a strategic advisor. But there were still things that we were working through before we provided our first loan. Little did we know in 6 months there was going to be a global pandemic. So always a good time to start a company, before a once in a millennia, or not a millennia, but once in 100-year global pandemic. And so we we had a lot of conversations about things to work through, but I think this idea of starting a business is it's one that always sort of is like, I think a lot of people have it, and then you look at the failure rate of those, and you sort of get scared. And I think by nature, as being risk averse, I'm an anesthesiologist, so the first question is, what could hurt my patient in this case, and how can I prevent that? Is sort of like an overriding factor. So you have to overcome that, and asking like, where who is going to be our consumer? How are we going to get them a product and a team that takes care of them, that they absolutely love? And is there a way that we can expand that so that that person can then, as a resident or an in-practice doc, can say, what, I was in your exact same shoes, and what really made my PGY 4-year easy or better, or so that I could strictly focus on taking care of patients, was this product. And so that was kind of the lens that we used as we sort of like built out doc to doc, and what that personal loan space would look like for physicians.
What are you most excited about as you think about Doc to Doc's expansion and growing influence and ability to help more and more physicians?
I mean, I think it's the sort of it's like the mutual sort of understanding that that a borrower has of knowing that it's a company founded by physicians, and largely the touch points are provided by a physician. And so, like when we finish medical school, we are all a member of that sorority, or we're all a member of that fraternity of, the House of Medicine. And so there's sort of this already kind of established connection there. And when you are speaking with a colleague, fellow physician, or a young physician, and you're a resident, you're a fellow, that was like, oh my God, I was totally there. I absolutely remember what match day was like. It was a long time ago, but I totally remember, the trepidation associated with opening that envelope. I don't even know how they do it these days. I did it in an envelope on a bulletin board. I don't know if it's like,
yeah, we did it 6 years ago, and I was there for that, and it was an identical experience.
Yeah, exactly. And but then there's also just, the sort of when you're an established physician, and maybe you want that opportunity to your point of like, gosh, it might be beneficial for you to buy into an ASC, to buy a bond, but it's a lot of money. A lot of people don't have $75,000 to $100,000 to buy a single bond, and don't have that liquidity. And your financial picture may look great, but you need that bolus of cash for that moment to take that opportunity. And again, when you speak to them, you can hear the excitement in their voice of like, I'm doing this. This is going to be great. Wow. This is perfect. I needed this money because this is a great opportunity to invest in this opportunity. So it is meeting, it is like meeting a fellow physician along their sort of life journey. As I say, life happens, whatever it is, positive or negative. And it is, collaboratively sort of meeting them on that journey and saying, that's why we're here, is to provide you whatever it is at this time period. Yeah. If you get the money and you want to pay it off, we would encourage you to do so. Because, we want to get you through this period, or get you to that opportunity, in as, quick and seamless and frictionless way possible.
Yeah. So for any PGY 4, 5s, and 6s out there who are looking at jobs right now, the first thing I would tell you to do is negotiate a $75,000 signing bonus for yourself. But right. Short of that, if you are thinking about transition costs and ways to finance that, and if you're looking at options, we'll throw a link in the show notes for doc-to-doc lending. You can talk to Dr. Lumbley and his team and evaluate if that could be a fit for you.
Exactly. The only other thing I would say about the sign-on bonus is a lot of practices say you've got to have worked a day and have actually filled out your I-9. So you may be seeing a $75,000 sign-on bonus, but you've now moved from your residency program to your new job, which is not an inconsequential amount of money to get you there. So a perfect example would be, if you got a contract in hand and you are PGY 4, 5, 6, or PGY 3, and you've got a contract in hand within 6 months of graduating, we will give you a sort of in-practice loan that's very different than the types of loans that we give to both residents and fellows that are earlier in their journey.
Cool. This probably goes without saying, but none of what has preceded this part of our conversation is financial advice for you, dear listener. And so there's no implicit or explicit recommendation of a specific product from doc to doc. I have gotten to know Dr. Lumbley and Dr. Marshall, and I think they're great guys doing good work, but you need to kick the tires on this for yourself to make sure that it is appropriate for you. So let's wrap with that, Dr. Lumbley. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, this has been great.
Us on
this has been great.
APM Success.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
If you liked what you heard this week, head on over to apmsuccess.com, where you can find more content and free resources to help you build a successful career in anesthesia and pain management. If you wanted to leave a review in iTunes, I'd also really appreciate it. Thanks for using some of your valuable time to join me today on APM Success.